The United States has suffered in the past 2 decades from a horrific opioid epidemic that has caused more than 500,000 deaths. In the first decade, in the 2000s, many of those deaths were caused by prescribed opioids, namely pills like OxyContin. But since 2015, there has been a significant increase in deaths due to synthetic opioids, especially fentanyl. The reality is that large pharmaceutical corporations in the United States are responsible for starting this crisis in the first place. That is a point that I will elaborate on in a moment. But instead of focusing on the corporate culprits, many right-wing politicians in the United States have tried to scapegoat foreign countries, especially Mexico and China.
China is the country that's currently, right now, murdering tens of thousands of Americans every year with fentanyl. It's depopulating parts of the country. It's pushing our life expectancy down. That's how profound a threat this is.
We've seen numerous far-right Republican congresspeople like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Dan Crenshaw who have openly called for the U.S. military to invade Mexico. Donald Trump's former CIA director and Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, has also called for invading Mexico, ostensibly in order to attack drug cartels. And they specifically are citing the issue of fentanyl and blaming Mexico and also blaming China. And this is part of the new Cold War on China. They're always trying to blame China for everything. However, what they're distracting from is the responsibility of U.S. pharmaceutical corporations, specifically Purdue Pharma. This is a corporation that was owned by the billionaire oligarch family known as the Sacklers. And there have been dozens of lawsuits against them, and yet they're almost never mentioned when we talk about the opioid crisis in the United States. What happened? It's very easy to explain. Companies like Purdue Pharma were essentially paying doctors to overprescribe pain medicines like OxyContin, which was produced by Purdue Pharma. In addition to paying doctors to overprescribe the drug, they also simply lied. Internal documents from Purdue Pharma show that executives lied. They knew that their drugs were extremely addictive. However, they lied and they told the public that they were not addictive. And as a result, this got millions of North Americans addicted to painkillers and opioids like OxyContin. And then when they could no longer get a prescription and they could no longer buy the pills, or if they didn't have insurance that could pay for it, or simply if the pills were too expensive, they looked for other ways to deal with their opioid addiction. And many people turned toward heroin because heroin was actually cheaper than OxyContin. And eventually people turned toward fentanyl, which is 50 times stronger than heroin. So it was the large pharmaceutical corporations in the United States that bear responsibility for getting their own population addicted to opioids. A West Virginia newspaper called the Charleston Gazette-Mail won many journalism awards for doing actual reporting on this and showing how big pharmaceutical corporations were pouring hundreds of millions of painkiller pills into poor states like West Virginia at the peak of the opioid crisis. They reported in 2016 that in a small town in West Virginia, a small mom and pop pharmacy received 600 times as many OxyContin pills as the Rite Aid drugstore just 8 blocks away. In 6 years, drug corporations showered West Virginia with 780 million hydrocodone and OxyContin pills, while 1,728 West Virginians fatally overdosed on those painkillers. This amounted in 433 pain pills for every man, woman, and child in all of the state of West Virginia. It should also be stressed that these pharmaceutical corporations targeted parts of the United States that are impoverished, where there is a lot of poverty and chronic unemployment, and it made people who suffer from poverty and unemployment addicted to painkillers, to opioids. People were especially hard hit in the so-called Rust Belt This is the area of the country that was deindustrialized in the neoliberal era as corporations sent jobs overseas to exploit low-paid foreign labor. And if you look at official US government data, the states with the highest rates of overdose deaths include West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Kentucky, among others. So the opioid epidemic is also related to poverty and inequality in the United States, which is extreme and getting worse by the year. Blaming foreign adversaries doesn't solve that, but it does have the intended effect of distracting working class people from the institutions that are truly exploiting them, which is large corporations. These corporations, owned by billionaire capitalist oligarchs, were responsible for the opioid crisis, which is still ongoing in the United States, not Mexico and not China. Even the New York Times reported on this back in 2018 in a bombshell story titled "Origins of an Epidemic. Purdue Pharma knew its opioids were widely abused." It notes that a confidential Justice Department report found Purdue Pharma was aware early on that its pain pill OxyContin was being crushed and snorted for its powerful narcotic, but the company continued to promote it, claiming it was less addictive. So while US politicians are trying to scapegoat Mexico and China, I'm going to read a few lines from this report from the New York Times, and it shows who the real culprits for the opioid crisis are. Purdue Pharma, the company that planted the seeds of the opioid pandemic through its aggressive marketing of OxyContin, has long claimed it was unaware of the powerful opioid painkillers' growing abuse until years after it went to the market. But a copy of a confidential Justice Department report shows that federal prosecutors investigating the company found that Purdue Pharma knew about significant abuse of OxyContin in the first years after the drug's introduction in 1996 and concealed that information. Company officials had received reports that the pills were being crushed and snorted, stolen from pharmacies, and that some doctors were being charged with selling prescriptions. But the drug maker continued, in the face of this knowledge, to market OxyContin as less prone to abuse and addiction than other prescription opioids. US prosecutors recommended that 3 top Purdue Pharma executives be indicted on felony charges, including conspiracy to defraud the United States, and they could have been sent to prison. However, top Justice Department officials in the George W. Bush administration did not support the move. Instead, the government quietly settled the case in 2007. Meanwhile, billionaire oligarch families like the Sacklers made tons of money, profiting as millions of people became addicted and hundreds of thousands of North Americans died because of this addiction crisis caused by corporate greed, caused by capitalism, not caused by Mexico or China. The very aggressive rhetoric of hawks in Washington has angered the Mexican government, and Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has criticized the United States for constantly threatening its southern neighbor. He has denounced Washington's meddling and declared that Mexico is not a U.S. colony.
Le recordamos a esos políticos hipócritas e irresponsables que México es un país independiente y libre, no una colonia ni un protectorado de Estados Unidos.
However, at the same time, the Mexican president AMLO has proposed that the US and Mexico can work together to confront problems like migration and drug trafficking.
Que busca que juntos enfrentemos problemas como el fenómeno migratorio, como lo del tráfico de drogas, en especial lo del fentanilo.
And in fact, Mexican President AMLO wrote a letter to Chinese President Xi Jinping asking for support from China in order to combat the issue of fentanyl. However, instead of taking up AMLO's offer to collaborate, the United States has blamed Mexico, always trying to look for a foreign scapegoat to blame for its problems. This clearly has frustrated the Mexican president, and in response, AMLO tweeted on April 1st that the United States threatened to invade. They sell high-powered weapons in their markets. They do nothing for their youth. They suffer, unfortunately, from the terrible and deadly fentanyl pandemic, but they don't address its causes. They don't care about welfare, only money. And when AMLO said that the US doesn't address the causes of the opioid pandemic, and when he says that the United States only cares about money, that it doesn't care about its own people's welfare, he is correct. He is telling the truth. With that, I'm going to conclude here. I'm Ben Norton, the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. If you like the work that we do here, you can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com/support, and there's several ways to donate. The best way is you can become a patron over at patreon.com/geopolitical economy. We have no institutional support and no big donors. We rely entirely on small donors, listeners, and viewers like you all. And whatever platform you're on, please consider subscribing to help promote our material in the algorithm. I want to thank everyone. I'll see you next time.